The contemporary seeker confronts a paradox of unprecedented proportions. Never before in human history has esoteric knowledge been so readily available, yet never has authentic transformation seemed so elusive. The Hermetic Principles, those 7 fundamental axioms articulated in the Kybalion and rooted in the ancient wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus, have been reduced to motivational platitudes, stripped of their operational power, commodified into content for digital consumption. This degradation represents not merely a loss of historical accuracy, but a fundamental misunderstanding of what these principles actually are. They are not philosophical propositions to be believed or disbelieved. They are not metaphysical claims about the structure of reality. They constitute, rather, a precise cartography of consciousness itself, a detailed map of the psychological territory through which the aspirant must travel to achieve genuine inner transformation. The historical lineage of Hermetic thought traces its mythological origins to Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes, a syncretic fusion of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian deity Thoth. The Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of Greco-Egyptian texts from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, established philosophical frameworks that would permeate Western esotericism for 2 millennia. These texts influenced Islamic mysticism, Renaissance magic, and the entire tradition of Western occultism. The alchemical manuscripts of Paracelsus translated Hermetic wisdom into the language of chemical transformation, understanding that the transmutation of base metals into gold was always a symbolic representation of psychological metamorphosis. Eliphas Levi revitalized Hermetic magic in the 19th century, recognizing it as the systematic application of trained will upon the fabric of experience. Manly Palmer Hall's encyclopedic scholarship revealed the persistence of these teachings across cultures and epochs. Dennis William Hock's work on the Emerald Tablet demonstrated how alchemical wisdom functioned as practical psychology. Carl Jung's depth psychology provided the interpretive key that unlocked the psychological meaning, encoded in alchemical symbolism, revealing that the ancient adepts were describing, in their cryptic language, the same processes of individuation that occur spontaneously in the human unconscious. The fundamental premise that must be established at the outset is this: the Hermetic Principles are not about manipulating external reality through mental tricks or positive thinking. They describe the internal architecture of consciousness and provide operational instructions for its systematic reconstruction. The true secret is not hidden in ancient texts or cryptic symbols. It is concealed within the structure of the seeker's own psyche, waiting to be discovered through rigorous self-examination and disciplined inner work. The transformation promised by Hermetic philosophy is not a passive reception of grace or a sudden enlightenment experience. It is the outcome of deliberate, methodical engagement with the fundamental patterns through which consciousness organizes reality. This is psychological work of the most demanding kind, work that requires unflinching honesty, sustained attention, and the willingness to dismantle cherished illusions about the self. The 7 Hermetic Principles, mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender, form an interconnected system of remarkable sophistication. They are not arbitrary lists of mystical ideas, but rather represent 7 distinct perspectives on a single underlying truth: that consciousness participates actively in the construction of experiential reality. The principle of mentalism establishes the foundational axiom that the all is mind, not that reality is merely subjective illusion, but that mind and matter participate in a unified field of being where consciousness plays a constitutive role in manifestation. This principle does not deny external reality. It asserts that the relationship between observer and observed is more intimate and reciprocal than naive realism assumes. The principle of correspondence, as above, so below, as below, so above, articulates the fractal nature of reality, the way patterns repeat across scales of magnitude. In psychological terms, this principle reveals how the macrocosm of cosmic order mirrors the microcosm of individual consciousness, and vice versa. The external world the individual encounters reflects internal psychological structures. Conversely, the patterns governing psychological processes mirror larger universal patterns. This is not mystical thinking, but recognition of structural isomorphism. The same organizational principles manifest at different levels of complexity. The principle of vibration states that nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. In modern terms, this anticipates quantum field theory's recognition that apparently solid matter consists of vibrational patterns of energy. Psychologically, it describes the dynamic, ever-shifting nature of mental and emotional states. No psychological condition is permanent. Everything exists in constant flux. This principle provides the theoretical foundation for transformation. If all states are vibrations, then consciousness can be modulated like a frequency, shifted from one mode to another through deliberate attention and practice. The principle of polarity asserts that everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pair of opposites. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Love and hate are not separate emotions, but opposite poles of the same spectrum. Courage and fear likewise. This principle reveals the fundamental structure of consciousness's relationship to phenomena. All experiences arise through contrast and comparison. The practical implication is profound. Mental states can be transmuted by shifting attention along the spectrum rather than trying to eliminate one pole and cling to another. The principle of rhythm declares that everything flows. Everything has its tides. All things rise and fall. This describes the cyclical nature of psychological experience, the inevitable alternations between expansion and contraction, enthusiasm and depression, clarity and confusion. Understanding this principle allows the adept to maintain equanimity during the descending arc of any cycle, knowing that the pendulum will swing back. More importantly, it reveals that attempting to arrest the natural rhythm creates psychological pathology, the neurotic clinging to states that must, by their nature, pass. The principle of cause and effect states that every cause has its effect, every effect has its cause. Chance is merely a name for law not recognized. This is psychological determinism, properly understood, not fatalism, but recognition that mental and emotional states arise from identifiable conditions. The adept who understands causation can trace effects back to their origins in consciousness and thereby gain leverage over seemingly automatic reactions. The principle of gender, that gender is in everything, everything has masculine and feminine principles, describes the creative interplay between active and receptive, projective and receptive, dynamic and stable forces. In psychological terms, this maps onto Jung's anima and animus, the contrasexual elements of the psyche that must be integrated for wholeness. These principles find profound resonances with other esoteric systems. The Kabbalistic tree of life describes a similar emanationist cosmology, where consciousness descends through increasingly material forms and must be consciously returned to source. Neoplatonic philosophy articulated the same dynamic of emanation and return, of the soul's descent into matter and its laborious ascent back to the One. Rosicrucian teachings emphasize the alchemical transformation of consciousness through stages of purification and exaltation. All these traditions recognize the same fundamental truth, that spiritual development follows identifiable patterns, that consciousness can be systematically refined, and that this work requires both knowledge and practice. The mentality required of the adept cannot be overstated. Magical will, the capacity to sustain intention without wavering, must be cultivated through discipline. This is not the ordinary will of everyday desire, but the concentrated, laser-focused intention that can maintain singular purpose despite obstacles and setbacks. Occult ethics demands absolute honesty with oneself, recognition that self-deception is the primary obstacle to transformation. The aspirant must develop the capacity for radical doubt, not the skepticism that dismisses everything, but the philosophical doubt that questions all assumptions, especially the most cherished beliefs about personal identity. This combination of will, ethics, and doubt creates the psychological laboratory within which genuine transformation becomes possible. The transformative journey mapped by Hermetic Principles unfolds through identifiable stages: each presenting specific challenges and opportunities for psychological development. This is not a linear progression, but a spiral descent into the depths of consciousness, followed by a reascent carrying the treasures recovered from the underworld. Jung's analytical psychology provides an invaluable framework for understanding these stages in contemporary terms, revealing how the ancient adepts were describing universal processes of psychological maturation. The initial stage involves awakening to the possibility of transformation itself. The individual living in consensus reality, identified with social roles and cultural conditioning, must first experience a disruption, what Jung termed the call to individuation. This may arrive as existential crisis, profound dissatisfaction despite external success, or an inexplicable longing for something unnamed. The Hermetic principle of rhythm becomes immediately relevant here. The individual recognizes that the oscillations between pleasure and pain, success and failure, that characterize ordinary life follow predictable patterns. This recognition creates the first crack in the edifice of naive identification with circumstances. The aspirant begins to see that consciousness is not identical with its contents, that awareness can observe the rhythms of experience without being entirely swept along by them. This initial awakening leads naturally to the stage of confrontation with the persona. Jung identified the persona as the social mask, the constructed identity presented to the world and eventually mistaken for the self. The principle of polarity illuminates this stage. The individual discovers that the confident social identity has its shadow, all the qualities deemed unacceptable and therefore repressed. The aspirant must recognize that the persona is a necessary function for social interaction, but becomes pathological when mistaken for totality. This recognition requires brutal honesty. The individual must examine how much of their behavior serves authentic expression versus maintenance of an image. This is excruciating work because it reveals the degree to which one has been performing rather than being, adapting rather than expressing, seeking approval rather than following genuine impulse. The next stage brings the inevitable encounter with the shadow, Jung's term for the personal unconscious, containing all repressed, denied, and disowned aspects of personality. The principle of mentalism becomes crucial here. The shadow is not simply discovered, but recognized as a construct of consciousness itself. What the individual perceives as external threats, irritating qualities in others, or inexplicable obstacles are often projections of disowned internal content. The shadow work demanded at this stage involves withdrawing projections and acknowledging that the darkness perceived in the world reflects unintegrated darkness within. This is not an intellectual exercise, but a visceral emotional process. The aspirant must feel the shame of recognized hypocrisy, the guilt of acknowledged cruelty, the horror of admitted selfishness. The shadow contains not only negative qualities, but also positive potentials that were repressed because they threatened the stability of the persona. Creative impulses, authentic desires, and genuine strength may all reside in the shadow, exiled because they contradicted family expectations or cultural norms. As shadow integration progresses, the aspirant encounters the contrasexual elements of the psyche, the anima in men, the animus in women. The principle of gender maps this territory precisely. Consciousness requires the integration of both active and receptive, assertive and yielding, logical and intuitive capacities. The man who has identified entirely with culturally prescribed masculinity must recover his capacity for feeling, relatedness, and receptivity, qualities projected onto actual women and onto the inner feminine figure. The woman who has adapted to patriarchal expectations must reclaim her capacity for assertion, intellectual authority, and spiritual aspiration, qualities projected onto men and onto the inner masculine principle. This integration is not about adopting opposite-sex characteristics superficially, but about recognizing that consciousness itself is androgynous, containing the full spectrum of human capacities regardless of biological sex or gender identity. The principle of correspondence reveals its full depth during this middle phase of the journey. As internal integration proceeds, external reality seems to shift in response. This is not magical thinking, but recognition that perception is always interpretation. As the aspirant withdraws projections and integrates shadow material, other people appear to change. They were never as threatening or as idealized as projection made them seem. Opportunities arise that were always present but invisible to consciousness, structured by unconscious patterns. Synchronicities, meaningful coincidences, proliferate as the boundary between inner and outer grows more permeable. Jung understood synchronicity as manifestation of the unus mundus, the unified reality underlying the apparent separation of psyche and matter. The principle of vibration becomes increasingly relevant as the aspirant develops sensitivity to subtle shifts in consciousness. Each emotional state, each thought pattern, each mode of attention has its characteristic frequency. The adept learns to recognize these frequencies with precision and, more importantly, learns to shift deliberately from one frequency to another. This is practical magic, stripped of supernatural claims. It is the systematic cultivation of psychological flexibility, the capacity to access different states of consciousness as situations require. The anxious rumination that dominates one moment can be shifted to calm observation. The depressive collapse into meaninglessness can be transmuted into acceptance of impermanence. The inflated grandiosity of the ego can be deflated into humble recognition of limitation. The stage of confronting the self, Jung's term for the archetype of wholeness and the organizing center of the psyche, presents the most profound challenge. The self is not the ego, not the conscious personality, but the totality of psyche, including conscious and unconscious, personal and collective dimensions. Encountering the self produces a paradoxical experience. The individual simultaneously recognizes their insignificance as a small node in a vast unconscious network, and their unique significance as an irreplaceable expression of consciousness. The principle of cause and effect illuminates this stage. The aspirant sees with perfect clarity how every action, every thought, every choice has consequences that ripple outward through the fabric of reality. This recognition brings tremendous responsibility. The adept can no longer hide behind ignorance or claim victimhood. Consciousness has been elevated to a threshold where choice becomes genuine, where freedom and responsibility converge. The principle of rhythm continues to operate even at this advanced stage, but its nature changes. The aspirant has developed what the Hermetics called the art of polarization, the capacity to rise above the swing of the pendulum, to maintain conscious awareness even as states fluctuate. This is not suppression of the rhythm but transcendence of identification with it. Emotions still arise and pass, thoughts still come and go, circumstances still change, but consciousness maintains continuity and coherence through these changes. This is equanimity properly understood, not indifference, not detachment, but stable awareness that can hold the full spectrum of experience without collapsing into identification with any particular state. Every authentic path of transformation includes a stage so challenging that many aspirants abandon the journey entirely rather than traverse it. The Hermetic tradition, like all genuine esoteric systems, recognizes this crisis as necessary, not an unfortunate obstacle but an essential crucible, without which transformation remains superficial. This is the stage Jung called enantiodromia, the conversion into the opposite, where everything the aspirant has built and believed collapses into its negation. In alchemical terms, this is the nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, where the prima materia decomposes into chaos before it can be reconstituted at a higher order. The crisis arrives differently for each individual, but its essential structure remains constant. The aspirant who has made genuine progress on the path, who has integrated significant shadow material, developed capacity for self-observation, cultivated discipline and will, suddenly finds that all this development seems meaningless. The practices that once brought insight now feel mechanical and empty. The realizations that once seemed profound now appear to be elaborate self-deception. The entire framework of meaning that sustained the work collapses. This is not ordinary depression, though it may share some phenomenological features. It is a specifically spiritual crisis arising from the dissolution of the ego's claim to be the center and author of transformation. The principle of polarity reveals the structure of this crisis. Every position contains its opposite. Every affirmation calls forth its negation. The aspirant who has identified with being on the path, with making progress, with becoming enlightened, must confront the opposite pole, that the entire endeavor might be grandiose delusion, that no genuine transformation has occurred, that the supposed progress was merely ego dressed in spiritual costumes. This confrontation cannot be resolved through reasoning or reassurance. It must be lived through, suffered, endured. The aspirant discovers experientially what the mystics have always taught, that God arrives only in the darkness, that genuine transformation requires the death of what one has been, that new birth is always preceded by dissolution. The psychological mechanism underlying this crisis involves what Jung called inflation, the ego's identification with archetypal energies and processes that are, properly understood, transpersonal. When early progress occurs on the path, when insights arrive and capacities develop, the ego subtly claims credit. The I who has done this work, who has achieved these realizations, who has transcended ordinary consciousness, this I becomes inflated with borrowed significance. The crisis of the dark night shatters this inflation by revealing the ego's fundamental impotence. All the achievements and developments that seem to be accomplishments of the personal will are revealed as spontaneous processes of the unconscious that the ego merely witnessed and retroactively claimed as its own. This recognition produces intense humiliation and despair. If the I is not the author of transformation, then who or what is? And if transformation occurs without the ego's control, then what purpose does the agonizing discipline and effort serve? This crisis differs fundamentally from modern pathological depression. Though superficial similarities exist, clinical depression often involves biochemical dysfunction, rumination on past failures, and generalized hopelessness about the future. The dark night of the soul, by contrast, arises from confrontation with a specific spiritual truth, that the ego self is not and cannot be the center of consciousness, that the personality one has constructed is not ultimately real, that everything constructed must be deconstructed before genuine reconstruction at a higher level becomes possible. The suffering of this stage has what philosophers call teleological necessity. It is suffering that serves a purpose, that accomplishes something essential. Pathological depression tends toward entropy, toward the dissipation of energy and meaning. The dark night, properly engaged, leads toward transformation, but only if the aspirant neither escapes prematurely nor collapses into genuine pathology. The principle of rhythm illuminates why this crisis is inevitable. Consciousness in development swings to extremes before finding equilibrium. The aspirant who swung toward identification with spiritual progress must swing toward recognition of spiritual poverty. The one who believed themselves near to enlightenment must descend into feeling utterly lost. The pendulum must reach its furthest extension in both directions before it can settle at center. Attempting to arrest this rhythm through spiritual bypassing, using meditation or positive thinking to escape the descent, only ensures that the crisis will return more intensely later. The alchemists understood this stage as solve et coagula, dissolution and reconstitution. The psychological structures that served the first half of the journey must be dissolved so that a new organization at a higher level of integration can emerge. This dissolution is experienced as death, not metaphorical death, but the genuine sense that everything one has been is ending without certainty that anything will replace it. The aspirant sits in the darkness without guarantees, without comfort, without knowing if there is any meaning to the suffering or any outcome beyond despair. This is the ultimate test of faith, though not faith in any external deity or doctrine. It is faith in the process itself, trust that destruction serves creation, acceptance that not knowing is sometimes the only honest stance available to consciousness. The ethical dimension of this crisis cannot be ignored. The aspirant discovers that spiritual development does not automatically confer moral superiority. Shadow elements that seemed integrated reveal themselves as merely suppressed. Selfish motivations that seemed transcended return with renewed force. The one who thought themselves compassionate discovers reservoirs of cruelty. The one who believed themselves humble encounters profound arrogance. The one who aspired to service discovers how much of that aspiration was actually desire for recognition and status. These revelations are devastating because they undermine the narrative the aspirant has constructed about their own development. Yet they are necessary. Genuine transformation requires acknowledging exactly what one is, including, perhaps especially, the aspects most contrary to the spiritual self-image. The resolution of this crisis cannot be forced or fabricated. It arrives, if it arrives, through a kind of surrender that is not defeat. The aspirant must release the demand that transformation occur according to the ego's specifications or timeline. Must accept that consciousness participates in something far larger than personal ambition or individual will. Must recognize that the sense of being a separate self engaged in a project of self-improvement was itself a misconception that needed to be dismantled. When this recognition deepens from intellectual understanding to lived reality, when the aspirant stops fighting the darkness and simply inhabits it with full awareness, something shifts. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. Life returns, meaning reconstitutes itself at a deeper level, and the work continues, now with the ego serving consciousness rather than claiming to control it. The goal of Hermetic work is not escape from the world, but transformation of consciousness, such that the world is encountered with clarity, compassion, and creative power. The philosopher's stone of alchemy, the integrated self of Jungian psychology, the gnosis of the Gnostics. These are different names for the same achievement. A stable, mature consciousness that has reconciled the opposites, integrated the shadow, and aligned personal will with transpersonal purpose. This is not a static end state, but an ongoing dynamic equilibrium, an achieved capacity that must be maintained through continued attention and practice. The transformed individual operates from a fundamentally different center than the consensus personality. Where the ordinary ego oscillates between inflation and deflation, grandiosity and self-doubt, the integrated self maintains stable self-awareness that neither exaggerates nor diminishes its nature. It recognizes itself as simultaneously infinite, participating in the universal consciousness that underlies all phenomena, and radically finite, a temporary localization of awareness in a particular body, culture, and historical moment. This paradoxical recognition produces a distinctive quality of presence, grounded yet open, confident yet humble, engaged yet non-attached. The principle of correspondence manifests in the transformed life with particular clarity. The inner work of integration produces spontaneous changes in external circumstances. This is not magical causation but natural consequence. As projection withdraws and shadow integrates, relationships shift toward authenticity. As the ego's compulsive striving relaxes, creative opportunities arise that were always available but invisible to grasping consciousness. As fear diminishes, previously avoided challenges become navigable. The adept discovers that reality is far more responsive to consciousness than the materialist worldview allows. The ethical dimension of transformation deserves special emphasis. The integrated individual does not transcend morality, but grounds it in direct perception rather than borrowed rules. Having confronted the shadow, having recognized the capacity for cruelty and destruction that exists within all consciousness, the adept chooses compassion and creation not from moral superiority, but from understanding. Evil is not an abstract theological problem, but a recognized potential within the self that must be consciously restrained and redirected. This recognition produces genuine humility, not self-abasement, but accurate self-assessment that acknowledges both the capacity for wisdom and the ever-present possibility of delusion. The responsibility accompanying transformation is immense. Consciousness that has been refined through Hermetic work gains increased influence over reality, not through supernatural powers, but through heightened effectiveness in action, communication, and presence. Words carry more weight, choices have broader consequences, and the influence radiated impacts others more profoundly. This increased power demands increased ethical rigor. The adept must constantly examine motivation, ensure that actions serve genuine benefit rather than ego aggrandizement, and accept accountability for the ripples created by their presence in the world. The practical applications for the modern individual are both profound and surprisingly mundane. The transformed person does not necessarily withdraw to a monastery or become a professional spiritual teacher. They may continue in ordinary occupations, but they engage those roles from a transformed center. The business executive makes decisions considering long-term consequences and impact on all stakeholders rather than quarterly profits alone. The parent raises children with awareness of how their own unintegrated material affects the next generation. The artist creates from authentic vision rather than market trends or critical approval. The scientist pursues research motivated by genuine curiosity and service rather than career advancement. In every domain of life, consciousness that has been systematically refined through inner work manifests as increased integrity, creativity, and effectiveness. The discipline and rigor emphasized throughout the work of the Hermetic school proves essential precisely because transformation is not sudden enlightenment, but gradual, systematic development. The aspirant who seeks dramatic experiences and supernatural powers will be disappointed or deceived. The one who commits to daily practice, rigorous self-examination, and persistent engagement with the principles will discover that consciousness can indeed be refined, that awareness can be expanded, that the quality of lived experience can be fundamentally transformed. This transformation does not remove one from ordinary human life, but allows one to engage it more fully, more consciously, and with greater capacity to contribute to the evolution of collective consciousness. The transformed self recognizes that personal development and collective development are inseparable. The principle of correspondence ensures this. As above, so below, as within, so without. The work one does on oneself radiates outward, influencing family, community, and culture in ways both visible and invisible. The individual who has integrated shadow material no longer projects unconscious content onto others, thereby reducing the ambient fear and hatred in the collective field. The person who has cultivated compassion through recognizing their own capacity for cruelty becomes capable of responding to others with understanding rather than judgment. The consciousness that has been refined through discipline becomes a stable node in the larger network, contributing coherence to the whole. The crucible that transmutes consciousness is not found in ancient texts or secret techniques. It is the disciplined attention brought to bear upon ordinary experience, the sustained will applied to the systematic observation and modification of habitual patterns, the courage to confront what one has been to discover what one might become. The gold the seeker pursues was never in external vessels, but in the awakened awareness that learns to kindle its own fire.